They have allowed the manufacturing capability, they have allowed the intellectual property to move to countries which actually bear us ill will, and I'm thinking particularly of China. And you'd have thought we would have learnt a lesson at the time of the coronavirus problem when all the equipment was made in China.
The coronavirus was one example, and now we have another with industrial capacity for large-scale warfare.
Well, indeed, and things we think less about, like semiconductors,
absolutely.
microchips.
Yeah.
And most of those, and I'm talking about Europe and America, most of ours come from Taiwan. And look what the Chinese are thinking of doing to Taiwan. They're looking at Ukraine and thinking, what lessons can we learn from this?
Yes, we are very exposed.
And we're very
front.
complacent. And even as we speak, our politicians seem to think nothing about, oh, well, it doesn't really matter. You know? Well, it does matter, unfortunately. And you know, cities grew up because there was a need to do things.
Yes.
People came together to create things. Industry, trades, all these sorts of things. And you can't suddenly stop doing it. We're all still wearing clothes. We're all still buying televisions, cameras, all sorts of things, motor cars. We have to move things around the world on ships and aeroplanes. So, therefore, surely as many of these things as possible ought to be made by our people here in Europe.
The coronavirus was certainly a wake-up call, and this term that was already starting to become more and more popular before the pandemic really blew up on everybody's lips, so to say. Nearshoring or reshoring,
well, exactly.
or friendshoring. In some cases still, for example in France, some things the labor costs are simply too high, but instead of having it built in China somewhere, they can have it built in Romania, in Poland, where labor costs are lower, but at the same time you're united within the European Union. You're not 3 oceans away, so to say. Even if some ship gets stuck in the Suez Canal, your product will still reach France, and it is reliable. So sometimes you need reshoring for production to come back to your country. Sometimes you just put it close.
As I think I've said before, I'm all in favour of free trade, which is you and I buy and sell things and governments don't intervene. But I think globalisation is not quite the same thing as free trade. And I think the politicians have allowed themselves to be conned by large businesses who appear to me to have shifted the cost of production to the taxpayers of the countries they're abandoning. I mean, that's a different issue for a different discussion. But I think there's, you know, and the key to all of this was when China was admitted to the World Trade Organization. That's when I think the rot really set in.
Yes, 1997, a year that really changed history in many ways, in which I think we are not fully grasping yet.
No, it's worse in the United Kingdom than elsewhere, because if you look at the amount of strategic infrastructure which is now owned by foreigners, particularly from China, it's startling, and we are sleepwalking into our whole economic future being determined by the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, that's peculiar to the United Kingdom. It's less of a problem elsewhere in Europe, although it's not completely absent. And it is really genuinely frightening. And we look at history, we think of history, and think, how have we got to this stage where we, as Europeans as a whole, are we ending our history now by handing everything over to the Chinese Communist Party?
It's also a side note, but since we have been talking about cities in this series, seeing the upswing of the Chinese economy over the last 40, 50 years, but really which started accelerating in the 1990s, also the level of urbanization in China and the cities that they are building there for all this money that they are making. In one way, when it comes to surveillance technology, for example, it can be quite scary. But some of these other investments they make, these projects, the maglev trains and so on, it's truly inspiring. And
oh yes, no, certainly they are doing some marvelous work in some of these
areas. And also the size of some of these cities. For example, around Beijing, Beijing is starting to merge with these 2 other cities, and there are some forecasts made for the future that once they become one urban area, it will practically be a city of 80 to 100 million
which is frightening.
Inhabitants. So and then connected with these maglev trains that makes transport between them very, very quick and easy, even if they are 50 or 60 kilometers away from each other. It does seem that there could be another step of the process of urbanization, and similar things can happen in other parts of the world. Probably not Europe, just because our populations aren't really growing, and we have already reached a level of urbanization that is in the high 90s of percent. But in India, you can imagine that this will happen to many cities, and there are even cities in Africa today, such as Lagos or Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, that they already have 15 million inhabitants, and they are going for 30, 40 if current trends will continue. Naturally, they will have even larger problems with pollution than the cities in China have, where it's mainly smog, and here we could have more of a problem with sewages, for example.
Exactly.
But it's interesting, and then if you compare it to how the European cities grew rapidly in the 18th and 19th and 20th century as well, we also face a lot of problems, and it will be interesting to see how these parts of the world will tackle the same problems and on an even larger scale.
Yes, in some ways it's quite frightening, isn't it? But there we are. I think if history's taught us anything, it is that there is usually a solution at some point. Anyway, Adam, thank you. That's been fascinating stuff.
Thank you.
All we've got time for this time, but as usual, marvellous stuff. There we are. All we've got time for. Fascinating discussion always is with Adam. We've looked at history from a slightly different point of view, urbanisation and the significance of cities. It's a continuing story, as Adam just hinted. Parts of the world we don't even think about very much are becoming dominant in terms of population, and with population size, history has shown us also comes power, something to bear in mind. Anyway, that's for another day. In the meantime, thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Poland Daily History.